Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presidential panel. We're so excited to have you here. We're here to discuss 30 years of the Violence Against Women Act, endurance, expansion, and the next era. I want to recognize ASC President Val Janess, who generously gave us a presidential panel slot for this topic. I really appreciate your leadership, Val. You've done a great job, and it's been a fantastic conference, so thank you so much. So our purpose today is to track the history of the Violence Against Women's Act, which was passed in 1994. Since then, the Office on Violence Against Women, OVW, has invested several $billions to support national, state, and local programs to advance policies and practices related to reducing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault and stalking, and of course, increase access to safety, to services, and to justice for survivors. Over the same time, other DOJ agencies have made similar investments. The Office for Victims of Crime has, unfortunately, the director, Chris Rose, is unable to be with us today. But we'll do our best to represent some of those equities and investments that they've made. And both VAWA and OVC, or OVW and OVC, have supported NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, and investing extensively in research on violence against women and related topics. So we're here today to talk a little bit about those investments, to trace the history, to talk about what we've learned and how things have evolved over time, to discuss both policy activities and how they've informed research activities and vice versa, and to look ahead to the future a little bit, because that's when it gets most interesting, right? What's left to do and what knowledge do we have yet to build moving forward. So we're going to each speak a little bit, and then we're going to just chat amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions. I do want to acknowledge all of the people on this panel. That does not replicate what you see in your program. I suppose I could have started by introducing myself. I'm Nancy Lavine. I'm director of the National Institute of Justice, and I'm going to invite our other panelists to introduce themselves very briefly, but just acknowledge that because we had an extra seat at the table, I made the executive decision to invite Dr. Janine Zweig, Executive Science Advisor at NIJ, to join this discussion, owing to her role at NIJ as a career civil servant, senior executive service level, who will remain at NIJ as we see this transition to a new administration, and importantly, has very, very deep expertise and research experience on a variety of topics related to violence against women. So, Greta, I'll turn it to you to just introduce yourself, who you are, and why you come to this work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting Ujima to participate today. It's a pleasure to be here with all of the esteemed panelists. Good afternoon. My name is Greta Gardner. I'm Chief Legal Officer for Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. We are a national resource center and training and technical assistance provider, wherein we provide resources and education, research and evaluation, and community engagement for pretty much anybody who asks at this point. We are funded by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office on Victims of Crime, and to my right, the Office on Violence Against Women. And so we do all things that regard domestic violence, sexual assault, and community violence. We have 5 technical assistance provider programs that address firearms and domestic violence, reducing risk through risk assessment tools, domestic violence fatality review teams, and also HBCUs helping those campuses reduce their violence on campus. And I think we have one more, but I'm sure that'll come back around. So it's really a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we'll have today so we can make sure that we are providing all of the pertinent and relevant research that's needed in our field today.
Thank
Dr. Hidalgo?
Well, good afternoon. I'm Rosie Hidalgo, and I serve as the Director of the Office on Violence Against Women at DOJ. Thank you so much, Nancy, for your leadership and for convening us, and to the ASC for hosting this panel, and very much looking forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
And I'm Janine Zweig, as Nancy said, Executive Science Advisor at the National Institute of Justice, and I provide advisement and oversight over the science offices, including the Office on Violence and Victimization Prevention, which Dr. Monica Mean is director of.
Thank you for that. So we decided not to use technology, but hopefully you can track along with us, although I have the wrong PowerPoint slide up, so I'm not delivering Rosie's remarks. I would never steal your thunder. So I was tasked, and I just want to acknowledge the real experts, both in the room and not. Dr. Angela Moore has been my right hand in many things at NIJ during my tenure, and also has deep experience and history with our Violence Against Women's program. And then Christina Crossland has really been probably the single greatest shepherd of our research portfolio and investments. And both of them collaborated along with Dr. Monica Mean and Dr. Janine Zweig to help me sift through all the information I could share around the trajectory of NIJ's role in creating research knowledge on this topic. And so I'm just going to run through that, not in too much depth. There's so much that could be covered. Basically, to divide my comments into 4 general areas. One is talking about the history of NIJ's investments on violence against women research. Then to talk a bit about the partnerships and collaborations in which we've engaged and continue to engage. And then talk probably the longest period of time on just some of the key nuggets of those research investments and what we've learned, and then what we're looking towards in the future. So as you all know, 1994 was the Violence Against Women Act. It launched a more robust investment in this topic, but to be clear, NIJ was working in this space long before the passage of the Violence Against Women's Act. It did infuse great resources and even mandates for us to build out the body of work. There in 1994, shortly after the passage of the Act, we partnered with the National Academy of Sciences to do a panel on the topic to help build knowledge on, what do we know and what do we need to know. There was, in the 1995, there was a panel on research on violence against women established by the National Research Council that was specifically mandated to develop a research agenda. And then that helped inform some early efforts on the part of NIJ, and those efforts were championed by then NIJ Director Jeremy Travis and Bernie Achter, if anyone remembers back in the day. I remember because I was actually working at NIJ at the time and bore witness to this huge investment. And those investments continued to grow, and periodically Congress would mandate another report on violence against women and what do we know, and that would lead us to take stock yet again and make changes over time. In the 2004 mandated report focused on how we needed to invest more in strengthening data and investing in longitudinal research. And then later on, we created a more organized, perhaps, violence against women and family violence research and evaluation program to put a more emphasis on the research to policy and research to practice connection, and have continued expanding on that work over time. Now, we have invested in a lot of different topics, research topics related to violence against women, and totaling over $160 million, thanks in large part to transfers from OVW, and we'll talk more about that partnership soon. Originally, it was around domestic partner and intimate partner violence, and that represents about 40% of our investments. But with each phase of revisiting the act and revisiting the research and the knowledge that was developed, we started branching out into other topics that came to our awareness or were even emerging over time. So domestic partner violence was the biggest piece, sexual violence more generally, about 20% of our investments, but then things like teen dating violence and stalking and sex trafficking. So there's a lot of different ways and topics that we've been investing in over time. And we have not done that alone by any means. There have been partnerships and collaborations with so many people. I'm just going to talk about the federal agencies, but perhaps I should have a whole nother section talking about all the partnerships with places like AJIMA and others to really ground our research in the needs of the field, the needs of the victims, the service providers, the survivors, and you know, the folks, the practitioners on the ground, right? And that's something that we do a lot of, NIJ, is that really engagement with the field. But in terms of federal partners, we've teamed up with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Department of Justice's Civil Division, of course, the Office for Victims of Crime, and last but certainly not least, the Office on Violence Against Women. And those have been very authentic partnerships, but to be candid, they've ebbed and flowed over time, depending on leadership and priorities. I'm really delighted to share that we've really renewed a lot of those relationships since I came back to NIJ as director. And, you know, dare I say, never underestimate the importance of authentic relationships. They really make a world of difference. And I'm really pleased to share that in my observation, the staff have their own relationships, and it's my hope that those will continue on. I have every reason to believe they will, even as the political leadership transitions off. So that's just very encouraging to me. We've done a lot of that work to establish that, those partnerships. So just to round out my remarks, I just want to share a little bit about some of the studies we've funded and the findings they've yielded. There's so much. Deciding what to highlight has been a real challenge. But in the area of teen dating, violence, and adolescent relationship abuse, we funded Giordano et al. To look at that topic, and one of the key findings there was that intimate partner violence tends to peak during young adulthood, but a little bit later for young women than young men. On the topic of sexual violence among American Indian women and men, Rose developed knowledge around the need for services that are specific to this population. The needs are very different, the services are different, the cultural competency is needed, that it's not any way a one-size-fits-all here. Farrell et al. Have done a lot in the area of sex trafficking, including developing more knowledge about the need to accurately identify those survivors. Work by Alessi in 2020 looked at issues of sexual and gender minority youth, and particularly focusing on homeless BIPOC youth and how they're experiencing much higher rates of victimization. So that intersection between already being, at risk and then being unhoused, and how those two can create even more challenges and vulnerabilities and really point to greater needs. Kernick and Martin did research with NIJ funding on victim recantation, finding, and this is super important, that victims who recant are more entrapped financially and emotionally and more likely to experience very serious violence, including to experience strangulation. And finally, but totally not the comprehensive list, very recent research that we summarized on law enforcement interviews of people who have been survivors of intimate partner violence, that training law enforcement to interview with a victim-centered and trauma-informed approach can yield much more useful information and information that can support making cases and prosecutions, as well as better enabling law enforcement to make the ties to the services and supports that the survivors need. So looking ahead, there's so much more to be done, and we're looking to the future, hopefully 30 more years of the Violence Against Women Act, if not more. When I came to NIJ, I put a greater emphasis, although it was already there in this portfolio and others, of ensuring that the research that we invest in is inclusive, that includes the perspectives and experiences of the people closest to the issue or problem, both practitioners and people with lived experience. That's a direction that I believe staff are very firmly committed to continuing on into the future. We placed much more of an emphasis on evaluation of what works. We spent a lot of decades building the knowledge base around that basic research, or what are the mechanisms, what is the incidence, what is the prevalence, what are the causes, what are the needs, but more information around what works to serve different types of survivors in different contexts is really important. There's always more work to be done to advance methods in theory and measurement, though, so that remains an interest to us. Another emphasis that has ebbed and flowed in NIJ over the years is whether and how much we want to encourage grantees to engage in research practitioner partnerships. But that's something we feel very strongly about, really build stronger research and research that's more likely to lead to changes on the ground. And then finally, we're big fans of interdisciplinary research, so just bringing people from different disciplines together to work on research projects usually makes that research all the more strong. So that's the end of my remarks specific to NIJ's history around our investments in this space. But I wanted to turn it to Rosie because she's had a lot of different really interesting roles that she's been on the ground and at the highest level in the White House and everywhere in between, looking at the policy trajectory and what that has meant for this topic and our investments in both research and policy and in the needs of the survivors. So I'll turn it over to you, Rosie.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And again, thanks to everyone who's joined us today. It is such an important time, and I really appreciate that we have this discussion here with the ASC conference this year. As Nancy noted, we just in September commemorated the 30th anniversary of the original enactment of the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA. And we all gathered in many different ways. We've held listening sessions actually throughout the country, all throughout this past year, really hearing from folks. What is working well? Where is this making a difference? And how can we learn from that and scale it up, as you mentioned, Nancy, how crucial that is, as well as where are there gaps and barriers and opportunities to continue to improve and really fulfill our nation's commitment to prevent and address domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, sex trafficking, and other interconnected forms of gender-based violence. And as we gathered with a summit at Department of Justice on the 30th anniversary on September 13th, we invited some of the original staff members from the Senate Judiciary Committee back in 1994 on then Senator Biden's committee that was looking at this. And what they shared with us was how crucial it was to center the voices of survivors. That VAWA would not exist but for those with lived experiences really being the ones whose voice and whose leadership, whose advocacy sort of brought this to the Hill, to Congress, at a time when people did not want to talk about this, when people would still joke. We heard from previous members of Congress that people called it the Take Fun Out of Marriage Act when people were proposing this, or just all kinds of other comments that showed that even the cultural paradigm around acknowledging the horrific harms of domestic violence and sexual assault were such that there wasn't even that type of comprehensive federal legislation. But what they were first tasked with doing was just listening to the voices of survivors all over the country. And that led to a report that came out of it called A Week in the Life of Women in the United States. And that report and those hearings and just the advocacy led to that original Violence Against Women Act, which was not easy to pass. It took like 4 years, and finally, as you all may know, it got attached to the crime bill that was moving forward in '94. And while there was an initial heavier emphasis on the criminal justice system, what's interesting about VAWA is that it's not static. It's not just the original legislation from '94, but rather the legislation itself calls for it to be reauthorized every 5 years. And for those of us, I'm looking at Greta here and others who've been in the trenches every time VAWA is up for reauthorization. In fact, 2 years prior, usually, folks gather all over the country. And the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence brings together many different national organizations working on this issue. But again, so much of preparing for the reauthorization of VAWA is once again sort of reaching out across many different issue areas to figure out what's working well, what can be improved in the legislation, where are those gaps and barriers. And research and evaluation is such an important part of this. So I really appreciate that we're having this dialogue today, because in my own career over the past 30 years, I've seen what a difference it's made when, as you mentioned, Nancy, if we really can have that research to policy connection and the research to practice connection, but also for practice itself to inform the research goals, right, and what needs to, and for policy evolution to also inform the research that's happening. We need it all to be interconnected, interwoven, and that's where I think we've made progress, but as you've noted, we have much further to go, and so that's why I look forward to hearing from you all too, what your ideas are, how we can further those goals. But I just want to give a few examples of where I've seen that play out. So for example, the original VAWA in 1994, as people were moving that forward, there were some people who were saying, well, wait a second, there are also some unique issues that impact certain populations. Because again, we know that gender-based violence affects individuals across all categories, right? Of race, ethnicity, income level, education, demographics, sexual orientation, gender identity, age. So we know that it's found across all these different factors, but we also know that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. We have learned how crucial it is that each survivor is dealing with a myriad of complex intersecting issues. So what does it mean, as you were saying, Nancy, to have that survivor-centered, trauma-informed approach, meet people where they're at, realize that we need a lot more than just calling 911 or getting an order of protection or telling someone that they could press criminal charges. This is way more complex, and I think we've realized that over time. So with each evolution of VAWA, when it was reauthorized in 2000, in 2005, 2013, and most recently 2022, we've seen how it's continued to expand and enhance its ability to grasp these complexities and really do more to broaden what we call a coordinated community response. So going back to that original VAWA, one of the groups that came forward was groups working with immigrant survivors, and they had done an evaluation. It wasn't a huge evaluation, but what we've learned, at least my experience, and Greta and I, as we have oftentimes gone to the Hill with fact sheets, we got to lift up the story of survivors because that makes it very real. But we also need some research and some stats to show that it's not just a one-off, that this is a larger issue. And if we can have some good footnotes, it really helps our policy advocacy, right? So it's all interconnected. Like, how do we lift up the stories? How do we then have the research and evaluation and stats? And then how do we have the policy proposal so we can put forward in a very concrete way to advance that? So one example was in that early day where IUVA was a legal service agency in DC, and they were working with others who were working with immigrant survivors, and they said, wait a second, we're seeing this other dynamic, that we're working with immigrant victims married to U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents who could petition for them as their spouse, but have chosen not to, right? Because what greater tool of power and control than to leave someone undocumented, without work authorization, too fearful to call the police, afraid of losing custody, afraid of being deported. But it was with that event, so IUVA had some stories of survivors, and we knew it was important, but then they also had an evaluation. to say, and with this survey that was done around the country with others working, that this is a crucial issue. And we've got to make sure that we're not setting up a system, in this case, even an immigration system, that sharpens the tools of abusers. So that helped in that very first VAWA in 1994 to include what's called the VAWA self-petition, the ability for an immigrant victim of DV married to a U.S. citizen or LPR to self-petition, and the crucial protections of confidentiality in order for them to be able to seek a pathway to safety and to be able to adjust their status that they would have been able to if a spouse was, supporting them. But all this to say, time and again, we've seen how the research, how the stories of different communities makes a huge difference, or on different issues. Housing, you mentioned housing, is a huge one. And I got to tell you, I remember one time we were on the Hill and we were meeting with the staff of Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa for VAWA, and we were getting ready for VAWA's reauthorization like in 2018. And he walks in and he says, I'm a prosecutor from Iowa, and I want to know, what are you doing about housing? And we're like, oh, wow, here's a prosecutor asking about housing. But again, he himself said, I can't tell you how many times I've been working, when I was a prosecutor, with victims. And at the end of the day, and it's exactly what you were saying, Nancy, like, the lack of access to safe and affordable housing, the lack of access to financial stability, a living wage, insurance, childcare, all these other things that people will be like, those are economic issues. That has nothing to do with the criminal justice system. No, it does. It's also interconnected. And I saw when I was a legal aid attorney myself, how often that I would be like, I've prepared your case, I'm ready to go into court for you, and a survivor would call and say, I'm not going to go forward. And oftentimes people engage in victim blaming, right? But no, it's that we have not set up a comprehensive system of support to really help people seek that pathway to safety. So again, as VAWA expanded, including a transitional housing program has been essential, including now as that has evolved, and research has been a huge part of that too. The District Alliance for Safe Housing in DC was doing some really unique work, showing that we need a range of housing options, not just DV shelters. Those are super important too, but you need the transitional housing, but also housing first, flexible financial assistance. They were doing some real innovative work. And again, it was when we were able to get some funding. We all had a convening about housing, and Chris Sullivan out of Michigan State, remember, she came and she did an evaluation, because then some people were saying, well, it's too risky. It's too risky to support people to be safe where they're at with flexible funding or a few months rent. And what we realize, of course, this exists along a continuum. There are some people who do need confidential DV shelters, but there are others who say no, to make me have to leave where I'm living and move to a shelter across town away from all my supports and transportation and my church and my daycare and where I work is not helpful, right? Many times I think we used to say to victims, this is what we offer, so this is what you need. And we've learned that no, we need to really work with survivors and say, what do you need to be safe? What do you need for your healing? What do you need? What's your pathway to justice? And how do we accompany you on that journey? So again, that research was so crucial, because some people said, well, it would not be safe to have these other options. And Chris Sullivan, working with Dash, working with others, were able to do some research that really showed the need for this broader perspective. And that led to a lot of good work that also enabled us to call in the Department of Housing and Urban Development and say, guess what, OVW alone with our little transitional housing grant program, and even FIPSA, which is super important at HHS, the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, that's not enough. We're looking at HUD and we're like, you all have $4 billion for housing. And they're like, well, you all do the DV part. And we're like, no, this is all of us. Yeah. Because if you're working for those who are, address those who are encountering housing barriers, and in fact, they had a goal of ending family homelessness. And I remember when I was in the government under the Obama admin, we all had a meeting around that. And we're like, you're not gonna end family homelessness without addressing DV. And so it was even amongst federal partners, getting out of our silos. Because we talk about how to coordinate a community response is so essential in communities, because it really is, but also across federal government. So it was those collaborations, the research, and then really now HUD is playing such a huge role. And they started putting out DV bonus grants. They are now funding their own research. And I'm happy to say in VAWA 2022, for the first time, we included that HUD is going to have a gender-based violence office there. And they were also able to allocate $10 million for training and technical assistance. But that started from a place of like them barely having this as a blip on their screen, but the more the research, the policy, the survivor stories, all of us working together. Another interesting and important aspect of all this, for example, is also the intersection of DV and firearms. And that's where research has been so essential. And we even just saw that in the Supreme Court case in Rahimi, where they were citing crucial research, right, that showed that if a firearm is present in a home where there is domestic violence, it's a 500% greater likelihood of a homicide occurring than if a firearm is not present. Again, we actually need that research to be a little bit more updated too. So we have a lot of great research that we need additional updates to, but thank God we're using that and then using other stats, but that's crucial. And the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, imagine there's such few decisions nowadays in the Supreme Court, but this was a recent case, I don't know if y'all have been following that case, where this individual who had perpetrated horrific, domestic violence against her partner, dating violence, was also perpetrating a lot of community violence. And the question was, could their firearm be removed because there was an order of protection against them? And again, this is something that was in the original VAWA back in 1994, but it was being called into question. But again, the data, the research, also the survivor stories, the ways in which this connects to other forms of violence, thankfully that's been crucial for us to preserve those important policies and now be working to expand them and really trying to strengthen our coordinated community response. Because one thing is to pass legislation and protect it at the Supreme Court. Another thing is to implement it.
Yep.
Implementation is so hard. And we are funding right now 12 pilot sites around the country, our firearms, TA projects, to really go into communities. Because again, that work looks different in different communities. And funding national TA providers, so UJIMA is one of those TA providers also. But again, ongoing evaluation is so important because we need to see how different models, different issues look in different communities. I also want to just lift up another crucial aspect is, as we've heard from communities, that they need a range of options for safety. Restorative justice has come up as well. And for a long time, our field was like, well, that doesn't really work in the DVSA space. But again, it's about centering and listening to the voices of survivors and communities. So this VAWA 22, for the first time, did include funding for pilot projects around restorative practices. And we just rolled out a significant amount of funding for this. Just in September, we announced 11 pilot sites around the country that are getting $1.5 million each over a 5-year period. And yesterday I had the great honor of visiting one of them right here. I went out to visit the Contra Costa Family Justice Center. They're one of the grantees. And they have a comprehensive family justice center. And they had started an initiative called CHAT, Comprehensive Healing and Trauma Approaches. Or maybe it's collective healing and trauma. But anyways, it's a great acronym. I got to figure out what it means. But they started small, but they had some evaluation dollars. Blue Shield Foundation of California had funded them, and that helped us tremendously. So sometimes even small projects, small evaluations, when we were then trying to go to Congress, and even when we were meeting with the Deputy Attorney General to explain to her like how this might be implemented, we were able to point to the National Science Foundation had done a research initiative on this. Blue Shield had funded this pilot site. All that helps us then to sort of scale it up. And I'm happy to say that in rolling out those pilot sites and having some national training and TA providers also to support them, we also just announced in September an $8 million evaluation project that will be run out of NYU. And each of those sites will have an evaluation liaison as well. So this will be important for all of us to continue learning, but to make sure that as we're exploring these pathways to safety, how are they survivor-centered, trauma-informed? What are the guardrails for safety? How do we screen out some cases that really should not be involved in a restorative practice approach? But how does it continue to broaden options for survivors? Likewise, with flexible financial assistance, we at OVW in 2016, in addition to the great work with NIJ and some of the VAWA pass-through to NIJ, OVW launched its own research and evaluation grant starting in 2016. So we just gave out about another $3.6 million in fiscal year 24, which brings us to about 60 different grant awards for research and evaluation, smaller awards, around $500,000 each. But we've given out about $25 million now. And so I encourage all of you to look at that. You can look at it on our website and look at the ways in which some smaller initiatives that really, and to your point, Nancy, we're really trying to encourage the practitioner researcher partnership. That's so crucial. Like, to pick projects that we can work together and not only look at prevalence issues, but we really need to be looking more at risk factors, protective factors, strengths-based approach For example, funding culturally specific community-based organizations to address those crucial issues from a strengths-based approach and from a more holistic approach. Looking at the work with underserved populations, looking at the work with tribes. In fact, we're on our way to tribal consultation in New Mexico next week, and we also have a 904 task force that's been rechartered, looking at this crucial research in Indian country and how important that research has been to the evolution of VAWA and the special tribal criminal jurisdiction. So I could go on, I'm gonna stop there, but just to thank you all for your interest, thank you for the work you're doing, and to say that we can definitely see as VAWA has evolved, the difference it makes when we're all engaged from different perspectives of enhancing this. And we did in fact issue a VAWA 30 report, so I commend it to you, it's on our website, and it charts the evolution of VAWA, what different programs were enacted at different times. And again, we also submit a report to Congress every 2 years called Measuring Effectiveness, which is so important. And there we list relevant research, and we list the information we're getting from our grantees, the data we collect from them that shows this is making a difference. So you can also see that on OVW's website. So more to come as we dialogue further, but thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. I think we're going to go to Greta next.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. So I think I have the fun part because I get to talk about, like, this is what we want, and this is what's not there, and here's what we'd really want you guys to work on. I think I would probably get fired if I did not say we 100% recommend growing more researchers and evaluators of color, so that when you do go into community, it's for us, by us. I can only speak for the Black community at this point, but I do know that we hear from the field that it is exhausting, and folks are tired of being studied by folks that don't look like them, that don't talk like them, and don't have experiences like them. So I will put that out there, and hopefully I can keep my job. I think, some of the things that have risen to the top for us that, when we talk to some of our colleagues and to folks in the field is quite a few things are bubbling to the top. One of the things, as a former prosecutor who loves VAWA and all that it has done, because I was a prosecutor in 1996, kind of when VAWA was first being rolled out, and we had a domestic violence prosecutor funded by VAWA, is, it's done amazing things. And I've seen jurisdictions where we have had a great law enforcement response, great prosecutor response, advocacy has been chef's kiss. We've even had a defense attorney who is, doing their job to advocate zealously for their client, but not necessarily get them off. And we've even had a judge who's just sitting there calling balls and strikes. And what's really kind of setting us back a little bit are juries. And so I would love to see some research on the impact of the knowledge of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, trafficking, what the community really knows and feels is domestic violence. Let's just say, for example, I remember back in the 90s when I would pull my juries and jurors would say, well, she shouldn't have been in his room, or I didn't like her, or her skirt was too short. And believe it or not, in 2024, we're still hearing that. And so I think we've done a great job with our VAWA dollars about, educating, training, and continuing the work with our criminal and civil legal stakeholders, but what are we doing in community? And so I echo some of Rosie's comments about really investing in culturally specific community-based organizations to let them do the work with the community, making sure people understand what the dynamics are of the work. So for example, one of the things that would be very helpful would be making sure that our language is accessible, right? Because I think that we're very privileged in so much as we do the work. We're on the Hill, we gotta talk the talk, walk the walk. But, we have domestic violence, we have intimate partner violence, we have gender-based violence, and ordinary layman folks, they don't really understand that. So how can we make it so that it's accessible and it's relatable so that when we really need juries to hear us, they can hear us? The second issue that has really been somewhat controversial but so desperately needed is and actually Rosie touched on it, what is working to make offenders stop offending? What is really needed? One of my friends and colleagues and mentor, Lundy Bancroft had once said that research showed that batterer intervention programs were far more successful when they were in community and when they were not ordered by courts, that there was more investment to go to the program voluntarily and to have accountability from their family, their friends, what have you. And that once they became court-ordered, the investment was, I need to get this done so I can finish my pretrial, my probation, or whatever. It wasn't necessarily a commitment to change because there were lifelong community consequences attached to it. I remember once feeling so incredibly sad. I used to be the director of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And a gentleman called in, and he was talking to one of the advocates, and he said, I do this, this, and this. Does this make me a batterer? And so she talked him through it, and we came to the conclusion that he had been using violence in his relationship. And he said, but where do I go? And there's absolutely nowhere for him to go in his jurisdiction without a court order. And so how can we garner more research and evaluation about what works? So I'll tell you, as a prosecutor, some people understood being arrested. I have had men tell me, you will never have another problem with me again. I did not like being arrested. Some people understood shock incarceration just for the weekends. I said, I need to know where you're going to be on the weekends when you have some free time. And it also helped the survivor because he was still able to go to work. Some people understand being incarcerated for long periods of time. Some people understand protection orders. We really need to figure out what works in different scenarios for different communities at different times. We need as many tools as possible in order to end violence. And you are the warriors that are going to help us put all those tools in those toolboxes. I think one of the other things that really we need more research on is how do we talk with, help with law enforcement of color? That is such a hard road to walk. Every year, or every other year, for the Conference on Crimes Against Women, I hold a listening session for law enforcement of color to talk about how is it to be blue during your shift and of color when you're at home. And when you have to serve in your own community, how do you go about doing that? And why do we expect different responses? And what is it like when you're trying to do the right thing? When you're trying to respond to domestic violence, no matter what the socioeconomic strata is, right? Because we know domestic violence particularly happens in all socioeconomic strata. Some people get arrested and some people get to take a walk, even in 2024. And so when we're talking about improving the criminal justice response, there's some research out there that women are better at de-escalating. I know that the campus space has a 30 by 30 initiative, 30 female campus officers by 2030, because they feel that that might improve the response. I would love to see more research on how we can support law enforcement giving a survivor-centered, trauma-informed approach. I've talked to many officers across the country. I have a training that you guys may know, Tom Tremblay. He is a former chief of police in Vermont. And we basically did a training where we showed the trauma of law enforcement is very similar to the trauma that communities of color experience on a daily basis. And if we can close some of those gaps so that we're a little bit more relational, perhaps we can expect a better response. We can garner more trust in the stakeholders that say that they are there to help and not to hurt. And then maybe we can see eventually more tools and ways of ending violence against women. I could go on for days. And so I know we want to get to a conversational part of the conversation, but I think that those were some of the highlights. One of the other things I think my boss, again, would be very angry with me if I didn't bring this up, is that to really get more evaluators and researchers to be proponents, champions, ambassadors of practice-based evidence, practice-based research versus evidence-based, that there's a place for both. And that, when you talk about culturally specific organizations that have very few resources, or you talk about communities of color, evidence-based doesn't always fit. It doesn't always work, and it gets really, really challenging. And like Rosie said, when we go on the Hill or I'm applying for funding for something, people want to know, does it work? And so I need a very varied amount of ways to be able to show it does work. So with that, I will leave it to my other panelists.
Right. Thank you, Greta. And just full disclosure, I did strong arm Janine Zweig to be up here. Not really, she's here because she wants to be, but it was yesterday when I said, can you be a part of this panel? And she's got, I don't know how many things going on at this conference. So I'm not expecting that you're going to deliver a 10-minute, narrative on everything, but I did want to invite you to share a little bit about your own experience and expertise in this area, and in particular how it relates to some of the investments by both NIJ and OVW.
Yeah, sure. And that is really how I come at this, as someone who's conducted research funded by NIJ and OVW for a number of years. And so I began my career actually working at a domestic violence shelter that was also the rape crisis hotline for the county at the time. And we were really scrambling to meet the needs of survivors. It was pretty intense work, I would say. And during the course of my time there, I really began to question whether what we were doing was actually helping the women that were coming and staying at the shelter in a long-term way to keep them safe and enhance their well-being. And so at that point, I decided to pursue a PhD to be able to study these issues and see what really would be helpful. And that was around the same time when the first VAWA was passed in 1994. After my graduate career, I landed at the Urban Institute and then for nearly 24 years conducted research focused on these issues, primarily with funding from NIJ and OVW over the years. The very first project I was on was the national evaluation of the Stop Formula Grant Program. That's where I met Dr. Angela Moore, who does like to say, when we met, we were both 10 because we're both child geniuses. But that project produced annual reports to Congress at the time, really trying to understand the implementation of that first round of funding that was happening from OVW and try to get a landscape of what the needs were for continued funding from year in and year out, and then also get some recommendations for reauthorizations. And so that was a really wonderful project to be a part of. And then since then, I've studied several provisions of the Violence Against Women Act and conducted studies to understand teen dating violence, sexual violence, and intimate partner violence. I'll just share a couple of examples of my work over the years that were directly related to specific things OVW was interested in learning. One was around tech-facilitated abuse. So my research partner and I, Dr. Meredith Dank, did one of the initial studies to understand tech-facilitated abuse in teen dating violence relationships. And so in 2013, we produced a report, and we were able to document that if a teen was experiencing abuse through technology, that they were 2 times as likely as other teens to experience physical violence in that relationship, and 5 times as likely to experience sexual violence in their relationship. And so that has led to a whole program of research at National Institute of Justice has continued to support and understand and also work toward developing prevention programs related to teen dating violence. I also did some work around payment practices for sexual assault medical forensic exams. And so my initial mentor at the Urban Institute, Dr. Marty Burt, I remember being out in the field with her, learning about how these exams are being paid for and the expectation that victims would be charged fees because of the nature of the medical exam for the forensic evidence collection. The original 94 VAWA covered that. It said these should be free, but that's all it spoke to on that. And through some of the work that we did, and then Marty, being a very loud voice,
Yes.
at OVW and OVC, she said, they're not paying for it unless they report to the police. And I literally remember walking the halls with her and her explaining to people in those offices that this needs to be we need to take another look at this. And so the 2005 reauthorization of VAWA now articulated much more carefully, these exams need to be free, they cannot be conditioned on a report to police. And so over time, that language in the reauthorizations has evolved over and over. In 2013, it then said, okay, if a victim agrees to having their insurance charged for the exam, you can't charge her copays or him or her copays. You can't make them meet a deductible first. It has to be free of charge. And so the articulation around the payment practices has grown, and I've done a series of studies over the years looking at payment practices and how public payers are participating in that process, but then also learning about the wide variation from state to state in terms of what is actually covered as part of that exam, because each state is allowed to define for themselves what's included in a sexual assault medical forensic exam. The VAWA authorization of 2005 defined 4 required elements, but many states have expanded that widely to include other kinds of medical care, and other states have not. And so there's more challenges around this to be addressed in future reauthorizations, but as I've said, over the years, each time it's been improving and improving on how these exams get paid for. And all of that work was done with NIJ funding or OVW funding. And right before I came to NIJ, just about 2 years ago, I completed a study for OVW looking at their implementation of the sexual assault medical forensic exam protocol, which, while not mandated, is promoted across the country as best practice for addressing doing the exam, the conduct of the exam, the payment of the exam, community collaboration, sexual assault response teams to work together, all based on research that has been conducted over the years. And we were trying to understand the uptake of that protocol in communities across the country. And so it's been a long journey of doing research and contributing to the field, and then I landed at NIJ a couple years back, nearly a couple years back. So.
Thank you. Janine, this couldn't be more fortuitous to have you on this panel and really ground, what we're saying from our perspectives with, I've been a researcher in the field doing this work and then making those connections between the findings to how they're informing continued changes and improvements in policies and practices. It's brilliant. I love it. So thank you so much for sharing. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. It's almost 3 o'clock. This panel ends at 3:20. We do want to leave time for questions from the audience. So I'll invite you to be pithy in your responses. But the question I have for any and all of you in no particular order is this challenge that I've been wrestling with when it comes to the question of what works, right? What works in prevention, what works in service provision. And Rosie, you talked about what I say all the time, which is one size does not fit all. But programs are developed in accordance with sizes, whether those sizes be gender-based nature of the type of harm experienced, culturally specific, and even within those buckets, we know that one size does not fit all. So what is your take or your experience around the value of evaluation research in informing the field, given that tension?
Me or
anyone or everyone, because I think we all have experienced it in different ways.
Right.
Yeah.
No, you're right. I mean, I think what's interesting, we did experience when we did the DV Homicide Intervention Initiative, I thought there were some interesting lessons learned from that were not so positive, but sometimes you need those experiences to some important hard learning. And the lethality assessment that had been developed in Maryland, for example, and implemented there, showed some good impact on how do we train law enforcement so that when they arrive on the scene, they have a better understanding of different complex factors and would ask survivors those questions to determine potentially higher lethality, and then make sure that they were trying to do a warm handoff to DV, service providers, and let those survivors know that there were additional services available. So the evaluation of that was important. But to your point, we later, I think people thought, oh, we can then just sort of replicate that exactly as it is. And then people began to see challenges, right? Because the way those questions were initially framed that led to that lethality assessment didn't necessarily represent other factors that people in different populations might experience. And we really do need to recognize that individuals can experience challenges, to your point, based on gender, but then also if you lay in their race or ethnicity, and if you layer on, sexual orientation, gender identity, if you layer on other things, multiple aspects that can increase their risks, the barriers they encounter in seeking safety and support, even the calculations they are making about what steps to take next and what is available to them. So all that being said, OVW did sort of fund a number of replications of that model, and we wanted to test how that lethality assessment worked, and I guess one of the evaluation components was fidelity to use of the lethality assessment. But at the same time, communities were different, and then we were looking at how to serve culturally specific populations, and a lot of TA providers were brought in saying, and I'll be honest with you, use a term I said, we can't come in and sprinkle culturally specific fairy dust on this assessment without changing it, but the researchers were like, yeah, make it culturally specific, but don't change anything, because we're testing fidelity to the model. And it was like 5 years of a lot of challenges, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of, so I think this time around with the restorative practice one, to your point, we're like, all right, how do we evaluate but allow there to be greater flexibility? Recognize that there isn't a one-size model, that we don't need to, to test exactly how that model can be jammed into different communities, but evaluating in a broader way and learning from how it looks with different survivors, different communities. So it is an interesting and important tension, and I think we're all still trying to figure it out. But
yeah, absolutely, and we talk a lot about implementation fidelity, but the need to also adapt to local context. And as a researcher, I think those of us who are trained in documenting fidelity run the risk of putting ourselves in the position of being auditors, right? Like, are you doing this and this and this the way it was supposed to be done, rather than kind of action research partners where it's like, well, this is what you're supposed to do, but we see that your population is different, and here's how. And so how can we talk about adapting this component or that to be more impactful? And so it's almost like I'm almost not a favor of model programs anymore. I'm more of a favor of model processes. But my thinking evolves. So anyway.
And I think it's relevant to the movement in other fields that I think this field is ripe for, which is a core components analysis. So what elements of this model are really driving the change, and we need to bring to other communities, and the context in which it gets implemented or the way it gets adapted might look different for different communities, but that we know these pieces are really critical to try to get the same results you're getting from like that original, demonstration model, which no one can ever replicate. So.
Right, and we find it never really works the same way somewhere else, and now we know why, but we pretend that we don't, and we just keep trying to cookie cutter it to different locations and populations.
Yeah, I think I would get a little bit more granular. I think I'm in complete agreement with you, but the cornerstones of VAWA have been to keep victims safe and hold offenders accountable. And I would love to see some robust research on what that really means. Because especially as we are moving into future and advanced technology, that's going to mean different things at different times to different people. And so if we had, a body of literature that really talked about the various ways that people, to legitimize safety, right? Or reasons why victims recant, and that may be their safety plan, right? Or, just to give credence to that, because what we do know is that communities of color, particularly poor people, when they get on the stand or they're trying to make a report, like they have to overcome a credibility barrier from jump. And so as they are reaching out to service providers or stakeholders, et cetera, to pursue a case or whatever they need, to have that other piece of research to say, this is why she's doing this, right? I mean, so, giving that to expert witnesses to be able to explain why this looks different than the other case, right? Particularly if you're having a bench trial, right? And the judge says, well, in that case, this happened and that was the standard. Now I'm listening to this and you want me to, buy into this too. And we can say, yes, and this is why, because safety means different things to different people, and accountability. We even discuss, I was going to say fight, but we discuss amongst ourselves about what does that mean. I just was in New York having this 30-hour conversation about accountability, and I think the restorative practices is going to shed some light on this about what that means, but we need something a little bit more robust so that we can, in the next VAWA, extend that, because right now so few people are going to qualify for it that I don't know if we're going to get any really good data from that.
A recently completed study funded by OVW looked at perceptions of justice for survivors. And what does it mean for different survivors? And that also can lead to different practices and different, because it's wide variation what justice means for.
And if I could jump in, the whole issue of offender accountability is a really important one. We've said that often, to your point, from the very beginning. And yet, that's one of the areas where we've made the least progress. Because, and you alluded to earlier, like the batterers intervention programs too. And I remember, in many ways, the ways many of those were structured was, well, if you've committed DV, we're going to hold this over you, right? That you have to come to this program, this many sessions. And if you don't, you're going to be locked up. And it was very much about the courts maybe exercising power and control over someone with threats. And I remember early on saying, and how is this effective? And the notion was well, no, they're being held accountable. That's what makes it effective. They have to pay $20, and they know they're going to get locked up if they don't complete it. But I feel like we've really not sufficiently understood what is offender, quote-unquote, accountability. If we're using power and control and threats to help someone understand that they should not use power and control and threats, it may not be the best way to bring about the change and the paradigm shifts that we're looking for. And we had held a roundtable at the end of 2015, at the end of the Obama admin, to call in some much more unique programs, and a lot of them were in communities of color, that were taking a different approach to working with those who had caused harm. And I'll never forget, there was a program run out of Texas where they said, in working with those who've caused harm, we have helped them realize that they need to take accountability for their own healing, that if they're not taking accountability for their healing, those who have experienced pain and trauma, if they don't transform it, they transmit it, right? And so I think our field still talks a lot about trauma-informed approaches for survivors. We haven't talked enough about trauma-informed approaches for those who cause harm.
Right.
And is there an accountability that factors in accountability for their healing, and how are we supporting that? Because otherwise, we're not really seeing the progress we need. But there are places where I think we need to do better research and thinking and move the needle on that.
And we have to be careful, right? Because we don't want to medicalize violence, right? We don't, and I have talked to some folks that I went to a conference, and I understand that only people who have this in their frontal lobe, that's what causes their violence. I'm like, stop it, right? So I think it's this real slippery slope that we have to be careful on.
Right, it's not to excuse, because violence at the end of the day is a choice. Someone's choosing to use violence. But again, I think we need to figure out a broader range of what accountability looks like. Yeah.
I have another question, but it's a doozy. So actually, I'm going to pause because I really do want to keep, y'all might not even like the question, but if no one has a question, you can find out what my doozy is. But I do want to invite members of the audience to ask a question of our distinguished panelists, if anyone so desires. Yeah? We welcome commentary.
And I think there's a microphone right here, just so that everyone can hear you.
Anyway, casual Friday for me. So it's so funny being here. I work for the state of Ohio, and my agency, I work for the government, and we help distribute. Oh, the camera is pointed at me. Damn it. We help distribute the VAWA funds, and so I just got assigned all of my VAWA applicants today, actually, right beforehand, that I get to review in a month. But anywho, I really just wanted to keep encouraging that flexible funding, because I really feel like I hear more and more and more from our service providers and agencies on the ground that they really need that. it's great to get like specific funding for like certain things, but there's all these other little side tasks with helping survivors and helping individuals and families that aren't covered by a lot of these funding, you know, like helping someone just fill out paperwork, like, and paperwork for like the victim's compensation thing, or paperwork to get a job, or paperwork to just like get housing and things like that. Like they just don't a lot of times get reimbursed for things like that. So like, yes, it's great to have flex funding, definitely for the actual survivors too, but also for the service providers like doing the work on the ground. Because like, even when I think about our rape crisis centers and stuff like that, that they're trying to bill as much as they can through insurance, but you know, they have to do all these other things that you cannot bill through insurance. And as they lose the funding, like everybody's losing their ARPA funding and things like that, and their VOCA funding got cut, so they're just struggling. They're trying to find creative ways to pay for everything, so it's just more flex funding for sure. So I really just appreciated you mentioning that and talking about that. And then the other thing I was thinking about in regards to more of that like research, connecting the research component with like the practitioners and the people like on the ground, is when you want to do like research with them, help them build the infrastructure to like help you do the research. Like I think a lot of these like smaller places or places that have just been around for like a long time, like serving communities that don't have a lot of money and things like that, they don't have like a lot of the nicer equipment or the fancy, a nice computer. And so they all had to be thrust into the 21st century with COVID when that happened, but a lot of them still don't have that infrastructure to just help with the research and like collect things more consistently so they know, not just for this tiny time period that someone is studying them, but like even beyond that to find out, is it still having an impact? Are we still doing good for our community when you guys are like gone? So,
Thank you.
Those are my
Thank you for
comments.
that.
Thank you, that's
Appreciate
so
it.
important.
Yeah.
We're helping grantees with learning how to use Microsoft Word. I mean, yeah, it's real, so thank you.
Right, and then, you know, a lot of these smaller organizations are still, you know, expected to report out on inputs and impacts, and that's really the basis for evaluation, but even the capacity to do that level of measurement is often a big challenge. So, I love that, and we've built those types of capacity building components into some, but not all, of our research investments, and I imagine, Rosie, you have as well.
And it is always a double-edged sword, right? Because without the reporting and gathering that data, we're not able to go to Congress and say this is having an impact and grow the appropriations. So for VAWA, we have been fortunate enough over these past few years to increase by about 35% the appropriations, the funding to VAWA, from what was $500 million in 2021 to $713 million now. But to your point, there'd been an increase of funding during COVID, recognizing the huge impact on DV and SA survivors and service providers. That led to an additional $1 billion that was, allocated through HHS because of quick research that was being done during the pandemic to show the disproportionate impact on DV and SA survivors and the needs in community. That funding is coming to an end. And so this is an important opportunity, to your point, where we need to sort of even evaluate what was the impact of that surge of funding. And guess what? To your point, it wasn't needed only during COVID. Like, this area has been severely underfunded, nonetheless, for decades. But we do need, I think at this point, additional research and evaluation to help us increase the funding sources and to help people realize that the federal government alone is not going to be able to meet these needs. It's also, where's philanthropy, where's local and state investment? And I think all of us together need to really just help people understand that investing in this has a huge impact. And so I think there's a lot more we can all continue to do together. So thank you for what you raised. Yeah.
All right, well, we have time for my doozy, but we probably don't have time for you to answer it. But I'm going to throw it out there anyway, because I've just been thinking about it a lot lately. That, in any field, in any area of inquiry, there's silos. Silos exist, right? And I'm just really curious why, other than the silos of people choosing certain strands of research, we haven't looked more at the connection between community violence and intimate partner violence and that which occurs in the home. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that and whether you see that as a gap as well. And I suspect some of it is funding streams, and I mean, I will name the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative. They're clear, no, this is about community violence, stuff that happens outside the home. But I'm saying, well, isn't there a connection? So.
It's funny you should mention that, Nancy, because we very much, when I was at the White House Gender Policy Council, the Domestic Policy Council was launching this whole thing on community violence initiatives, and we were like, fabulous. Let's talk about the intersection of GBV and community violence, right? And quickly heard from multiple places, like, you all stay in your lane, you got GBV, you got VAWA, this is not about that, it's about community violence. And you're right, I think those silos often exist, and as a colleague of mine, Mark Wallace from DOJ had said, he goes, well, sometimes the word silos doesn't resonate as much. I call them cylinders of excellence.
Right.
We are all in our cylinders of excellence, and nobody wants anyone else stepping in. But the more we all began to dialogue, to your point, and begin to see those connections, and we worked together on the first ever U.S. national plan to end gender-based violence. If y'all have not seen it, it was a great collective effort with input from over 2,000 people, 15 federal agencies, just really trying to illuminate what are some of those intersections across many issue areas. And it's got various pillars, and research is illuminated in its own pillar, Pillar 7, but also across the other pillars. We talk about how crucial research is. And there, we have a part about community violence that, to your point, Nancy, was hard to even get written because people are like, but this is about the plan to end GBV. But the more that we have all together worked on this, finally the Conference on Community Violence did have a panel on domestic violence and SA. And people heard from those in community who have been doing this work that said, finally, you all are talking about DVSA, thank you. Because that does play a role. Children and young people, right, the ACEs studies, who witness violence, the impact it has on them, violence that then spills out in community. And in fact, when I was down in Birmingham, Alabama, visiting one of our FTAP sites, the firearms TA site, they said that they began to realize the high correlation of domestic violence firearms cases with community violence. And they started keeping stats and realized, like, oh, wait, this individual who's threatening with a firearm in the home is actually someone much more likely to commit community violence. And if we go and take these DV cases seriously and work with the U.S. Attorney and others to prosecute that case and remove the firearms, they realized that they were also having a significant impact on reducing community violence. And Bob Traster in Oklahoma City started tracking the same thing. When they started working on the high, and these are repeat offenders, high lethality, DV firearms, when they started prioritizing, and they said at first we weren't taking those cases. They're like, oh, that's just DV. U.S. Attorneys, ATF, we don't really do DV. We do violent crime. So when they started looking at those cases, and tracking it, high correlation to people who have been committing community violence. So you're right, I think we have to and they realized, this is the other thing, the other silo was sometimes people they were saying, well, some U.S. attorneys only prosecute as a firearm offense and say it's a victimless crime. And then but he said, no, we have to work real closely with the Family Justice Center. We have to work real holistically with the survivor and the children who experience those harms. So again, it behooves all of us to get out of our silos, and that is sort of a cornerstone of VAWA, is the coordinated community response, bringing in all these different players. So I have seen huge progress, I must say, even in the past 2 years, of people being willing to start talking more at these intersections, and I think we all got to keep building on that.
Exactly. Greta, Janine, anything to add to that?
Do you want to go first?
I would just quickly say the ripple effect is further to public health too, and a lot of the public health work that's focused on community-based healthy marriage programs and their interest in trying to identify different types of domestic violence that's happening, and therefore they're tailoring their approaches in response, and how we can sort of marry that with some of the work that we do. Because I do think the reduction of our cylinders of excellence does get us to a place that can be where I can't remember who said it at the Vow 30 event, said we're working ourselves out of a job. Like, that's what the goal is here. And I think we need to have that collaboration at the federal level to do that.
So I'm going to be unpopular probably and say that,
I knew it was a dicey question.
yeah, I think that, gender-based violence and community violence has been very much racialized, because when you think about community violence, you think of gangs and, poorer people and people of color fighting, firearms, drugs, gangs, and all that. And that's, in my world of the law enforcement and legal, remedies and resources, like, that's a sexier thing to be involved in. Like, that's the homicides, that's the drugs, that's the big cases. And so that's almost a little bit like low-hanging fruit, and it's easier, right? Gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, those are really complicated because you have to deal with the human condition. And people would much rather believe a beautiful lie than the ugly truth, because then once you know the ugly truth about how we can cause harm to each other, you actually have to do something about it. It's way easier to do something about gang violence or drugs or firearms. But I will say, and to the credit of OVW, we were funded to look at community violence and community violence interrupters so that we can learn lessons from that rubric or that approach, so that maybe we can apply some of the lessons learned to fighting gender-based violence.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing. Guess what, y'all? It's 3:20. We have closed out the panel. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives. Thanks to Janine for joining the panel on late notice, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Your stepping in. It's always great to have someone talk about your
Yeah,
experience doing the important